This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Richard Burke his new book, Empire and Revolution, The Political Life of Edmund Burke. Richard Burke is professor in the history of political thought and co-director of the Center for the Study of the History of Political Thought at Queen Mary University of London. He is the author of Peace in Ireland, The War of Ideas, and he's the co-editor of Political Judgment. Richard Burke, glad to have you today.
Very pleased to be with you.
So this book is a tremendous work. Many scholars who have reviewed it have said it's one of the most impressive contributions made on Edmund Burke. In your book, you try to argue, and I think you do successfully, that the puzzles that many scholars think they have found, or the contradictions and inconsistencies in Edmund Burke's thought, largely can be understood. So if we think about Edmund Burke, so much of the inconsistencies seem to revolve around things like his defense of the American colonists and their push for independence from the British Empire, yet an opponent of the French revolutionaries. He's a defender of a certain kind of imperial sovereignty, yet he goes after Britain's Governor General of India for colonial abuses in India. He's also an opponent of many of the policies of Britain and Ireland, the so-called popery laws, yet he's a defender of the established church. More generally, Leo Strauss famously argued in his book, Natural Right and History, that he was a historicist thinker of little use to someone trying to articulate a defense of liberty in the modern age, and yet Peter Stanlis argued he's not a historicist. He's a profound natural law thinker. So, Richard, maybe step in and help us understand these contradictions and inconsistencies, which you argue actually can be understood as a unity in his thought.
Yes, well, first of all, thanks very much for those warm words about the book. You're right that Burke is often seen as a figure who is either responsible for having issued a series of political doctrines that are in contradiction with one another, or else a series of beliefs that are somehow inconsistent. And it's indeed correct that I want to really strongly argue against that claim. That's not to say, of course, that there's no development of Burke's career and thought. Of course there is. He's a human being. Events change. He had to adapt and respond to them. So I'm not trying to say it's some sort of seamless philosophical whole. I think that would be a misrepresentation too. But the key point, I believe, is that subsequent figures or contemporaries have projected onto Burke the expectation that he should share their values, and where he doesn't, they call that inconsistency. So the inconsistency story really began in the 1790s. So Burke is born in 1730 and dies in 1797. So late in his career, in the midst of the French Revolution, in relation to which he took up a controversial position, contemporaries of his, the figures in his own party, the Whig Party, began to view Burke as having betrayed his earlier principles, for instance, having supported the American Revolution in criticizing the French. Now, the key figure in that drama was Charles James Fox, a colleague of Burke's with the Rockingham Whigs throughout the 1770s and 1780s, who supported the French Revolution for his own reasons. Burke did not, so he began to allege that Burke was being inconsistent or in a state of contradiction with himself. So the point to bear in mind is really the origin of this claim against Burke is deeply political. That's to say, it's a former ally. And if you view it from Burke's position, of course, Fox is himself entirely inconsistent. So really the inconsistency allegation is just former friends believing on either side that the former ally has betrayed them. So it's a deeply political allegation. But from the point of view of scholarship in the 20th century, we can obviously avoid all that. And we need to accept that. There is no inconsistency in defending aspects of the American Revolution and criticizing the French Revolution altogether. Just to be specifically clear about that, Burke defended the right of the Americans to take up arms against the British government, but he didn't defend all aspects of the revolution. That's to say, he didn't actually defend independence. He wasn't a supporter of American secession, but he defended the right to take up arms against political tyranny. However, he believed that this did not apply in France. He believed that it was a case of the French monarchy reforming government in France in order to improve circumstances, a situation for the population at large, and in the context of that, unnecessarily revolutionaries making a bid against the state in the name of principles which were simply unsustainable. So that was his problem with the French Revolution. So that's the key one. How does one reconcile America with his positions on America and his positions on France? Well, my answer to that is very easily. It's only 20th century opinion sees these events as somehow coterminous with one another. So that's my overall view on that subject.
In the opening chapter, you have a discussion of Montesquieu and his importance to Burke's thought, although you also say we shouldn't understand Montesquieu as sort of providing a program that Burke would pursue intellectually. But there is this discussion of the rights of conquest, which Burke will defend, versus the spirit of conquest. And then there's also the spirit of liberty, which you seem to argue there's a conversation between Burke, or Burke is having a conversation with Montesquieu there, and thinking about applications of these principles that Burke will abhor. So do we get sort of the spirit of conquest with regard to the East India Company in India that Burke will later abhor? We have something like a change in British policy that Burke recognizes regarding the Americans as providing something like, not the right of conquest, I should say, but sort of a more unbounded application of British power rather than a measured application as well, and sort of its imperial power. So I wanted to get you to talk about that, and because I think that's a really something significant you do with Burke's thought in the book.
Sure. Well, first of all, as you say, I think it's important to draw a distinction, as Burke did, between the right of conquest and the spirit of conquest. That's to say, the right of conquest, which Burke, for instance, believed that the British had in the context of Bengal in the 18th century, derives from the rights of war. That's to say, if a native Bengali army attacks a British trading factory, you have a right to defend yourself. And having a right to defend yourself, if you're victorious, you conquer. That's the way it is. So under the rights of war, you have a right of conquest. And if you acquire territory thereby, as an extension of your right of self-defense, that is acceptable under the laws of nature and under the law of nations. So that is not a violation of fundamental principle. It's a defense of your effectively inalienable rights. The spirit of conquest is something entirely different. As soon as you conquer a new territory, forced to by necessity, by self-defense, you then are obliged to exercise power over that newly acquired population with due moderation and responsibility. The opposite of doing that would be the spirit of conquest, or the spirit of domination, if you like. That's to say, you would be treating the population as if you were governing them under war conditions, dominating them rather than allowing them to flourish. So Burke believed, generally speaking, and in this he to a certain extent did follow Montesquieu, whom you mentioned, believed that Europe over time, its history since really, the 8th century, had been a gradual, progressive development whereby the spirit of liberty had come to prevail. However, it had come to prevail precariously and was threatened on all sides by potential subversion. So the art of politics was really very much to preserve that spirit, the spirit of liberty, which is the opposite, of course, of the spirit of conquest. So in the face of all threats from conquest, you preserve the spirit of liberty. And for Burke, that was achieved on the one hand by sustaining a mixed system of government, and on the other hand, by doing that, by having an effective party system. So these are certain, in some of these areas that Burke was strongly influenced by Montesquieu. First of all, having a vision of European history altogether as the necessary background context for understanding what was actually going on at the time. And second of all, for instance, defending, specifically in relation to Britain, in fact, the institutions of having political parties, which other contemporaries, for instance, opposed, like almost contemporary of Burke's David Hume. So, that's a broad. So, that, if you like, that is Burke's sort of overarching philosophy.
Is there something in there, this spirit of liberty? Not necessarily spirit of conquest, but in thinking about, and it's sort of just what we started with, the sort of apparent discontinuous parts of Burke's thought that people think they find, or the inconsistencies. Is there a unifying thread here in the spirit of liberty, and more specifically, the way he thinks about or what British constitutionalism should be at its best, and his role as a member of Parliament and as a writer, a public figure, in trying to achieve some sort of the best balance within those different parts of the constitutional order?
Yes, I mean, that's very much the case. I mean, Burke, a lot of people think about Burke as looking forward to the 19th or the 20th century, but what Burke actually did, naturally, as we all do ourselves, is look backwards and to gain, political orientation. And what he believed is that 18th century Europe generally, but also Britain in particular, had finally managed to pacify the forces of destruction that had erupted in the 17th century and which we call the Wars of Religion, which had afflicted France, Germany, and also Britain itself in terms of the Civil War, or as it's sometimes called, the War of the Three Kingdoms. Now, the achievement of the British Constitution was very much a political instrument for, as it were, pacifying those forces and out of conflict establishing a sort of pax, which is a constitution, a balance of forces. So Burke's political thought and action is very much geared towards preserving the health of that balance against deterioration into sort of disintegrating conflict such as had been seen in the 17th century. And that meant, of course, a proper balance between Parliament and King, between the elements of the Parliament itself, and, of course, in the judicial system altogether. I mean, overall, Burke's ideal, if you like, was the maintenance of a society advancing in terms of prosperity and also civil liberty, which meant, of course, freedom of possession, security of person, and so on and so forth. His goal was not really political liberty in the technical sense of he didn't think we had a right to a particular form of government, but we had a right to freedom of conscience, a right to property, a right to personal security, and the best way of securing those was by the particular form of mixed constitution such as Britain had achieved and which he admired.
In his period specifically, you talk about George III. And his use of power, his use of an executive monarchical power, undoing or threatening to undo the system through not necessarily trying to work with Parliament, but through favorites or through men that he was able to appoint and lead. But talk about that, because I think that's important in situating Burke's opposition to British policy in North America and the colonists, and the insistence on largely interfering where it had left matters alone largely. So if you could talk about that, I think that would be great.
Yes, well, that would follow on directly from what I was just saying, and that's to say Burke was very much defending the British mixed constitutional system of government, and that meant keeping the various elements in place. One of those elements is, of course, the king, and during the period of Burke's political maturity, that king was George III. George III came to the throne in 1760, and Burke entered Parliament in 1766. And throughout the first decade, should we say, in Parliament, Burke, along with his colleagues in the Rockingham Whig Party, believed that George III had excessive and improper ambitions for the crown, and they saw themselves as trying to limit these. Now, one very important thing to understand about the wider imperial conflict is that Burke and his colleagues believed that George III was especially seeking to advance his executive prerogatives by advancing his interests, for instance, in the colonies and also in India. So they thought that he would become, if you like, a sort of Louis XIV figure via the empire. So what he couldn't, so his means of, as it were, elevating himself in the domestic scene was by advancing his interests abroad. And for instance, in the case of India, that would have been using his ministers to raise a revenue in Bengal, which would, of course, been a financial benefit to government and crown. And similarly, they saw the policy of ministers in the late 1760s through to, should we say, 1780. That's a series of ministers under George III. That their attempts to raise taxation in America was part of this, as far as Burke was concerned, wider program of monarchical ambition, which threatened via the empire to subvert domestic liberty.
So Burke in this use of monarchical power, which you argue is somewhat unbounded or operating outside of the norms of constitutional practice, Burke says, with regard to the North American colonies, don't tax them or don't interfere with the regulations you're proposing, but yet preserve the principle that you could. He tries to find some sort of medium, some sort of a position that will reconcile both contesting parties, and yet this largely fails, or does fail.
Yes. Okay. So actually, the very month in which Burke appeared in Parliament, January 1766, the American crisis was, of course, immediately the major issue for debate in the Commons at the time, because the previous government had passed the Stamp Act, and now the Rockneymites controlling the ministry, and Burke was, one of their allies, one of their friends, one of their members, opposed the Stamp Act and sought its repeal. Having repealed it, however, they decided at the same time to assert the right of Parliament to supreme power, if you like, to have ultimate sovereignty within the empire. So their view was that technically, yes, there is ultimate authority at Westminster for imperial affairs generally. However, prudent government is such a kind of government as does not exercise the plenitude of power which it holds by right. Now that policy, if you like, took the form of the Declaratory Act, which stated that in the last instance, final authority lay with Britain. However, consistently throughout the late 1760s and all through the 1770s, Burke and his colleagues argued that all further attempts to raise a revenue in America were an improper violation of colonial liberties, and they opposed them on that basis. They thought colonies had two potential purposes in modern European history. Either they were a source of revenue or they were part of a circuit of trade. For Burke, they'd always been part of the British extended commercial world, but had not been established as colonies for revenue, and therefore this was a violation of fundamental principle and should not be countenanced. So, yes, indeed, a defence of the ultimate authority of the British Parliament, but not for exercising it improperly. So there would be sort of a reserve right in the case of an emergency, but it was improper to exercise those rights against the established customary entitlements of the colonists.
That sort of raises a question, though. How does, that would be distinguishing between something that's a practice and a custom, or you say a fundamental norm. For Burke, how does that process happen? I can imagine many arguing, well, so we haven't taxed them, but we need to tax them. And they owe us. Look what we just did for them. We just secured the continent for their expansion potentially, or for their use uninhibited. Don't they owe us? And shouldn't that now be a part of how we regulate these guys?
Yes, of course, that was the ministerial position of the day. Basically, Britain had fought the 7 Years' War, during which, of course, they defended the American colonies. As a result of that, it was facing bankruptcy, as, of course, was France itself at the time. In the face of the enormous debt that had been incurred, it was necessary to raise taxation from somewhere, and therefore, a succession of ministries argued we must develop some system of taxation to impose on the colonists. Burke believed that this practice, if you like, as you've called it, might be a final ultimate entitlement, but first of all, it was not a necessity. There were other ways of raising revenue, and second of all, it was simply not viable. That's to say, Burke's original position, for instance, on the riots in response to the Stamp Act had been, as we can see from some of the notes that he took at the time, was that it was actually militarily impossible to impose British ministerial will on the colonists. So, for instance, if one were to impose the Stamp Act, it would have been necessary to transport an army and to fight a campaign in winter across the other side of the Atlantic with poor chances of success. So much of Burke's judgment was really prudential. You're only going to enforce your will by an act of really consummate conquest. If you do that, you're going to enslave the colonies, and therefore you're going to undermine the very purpose for which you might have colonies in the first place. So, of course, he appreciated the fact that, indeed, Britain was in debt and that Britain needed to raise revenues, but there were many ways of doing that, and one was going to have to do it ultimately, if you're talking about a large, extended, detached empire in the period of, marine empires, one was going to have to do that by consent. One just had no choice. Yeah. So one couldn't enforce one's will. One was going to have to operate on the basis of, trans-imperial consensus.
I suppose, in thinking about the question I was trying to ask, question would be for me, foundations of constitutionalism, practices, prudential management of conflicts, reconciling competing parties. But then for Burke, and this also goes to a question I asked at the beginning, or not a question, but just pointing out two different views of Burke, seeing Burke as a historicist type of a thinker versus a natural law thinker.
Yes.
And Burke uses the term natural right a lot. How does natural right inform his understanding of positive law? What's the relation? What's the conversation between those two things?
Yes, well, that's an excellent question, Richard. Now, I was actually going to come back to that. You mentioned at the beginning, on the one hand, that Leo Strauss wrote an essay in which he argued that Burke was an historicist, and on the other hand, for instance, Peter Stanley had long argued, and based really a school of American conservatism on the idea that Burke was a natural law thinker. And in a way, this is a reworking of earlier positions, whereby Burke was, on the one hand, called a utilitarian, on the other hand, a natural rights thinker. So how do we reconcile all these positions? Well, for me, they are reconcilable, and it goes as follows. First of all, Burke did believe in natural rights. I mean, so we can find evidence for this. The question is then how you explain it in relation to other statements that he made about the necessity for prudence. So we can find these statements of Burke. On the one hand, the highest virtue in politics is prudence. On the other hand, you can see him repeatedly defending a certain version of natural rights. So the first thing to emphasize is these are clearly not incompatible for him. And modern academic scholarship tends to reconstruct the past in terms of schools of thought and then imagine that somehow they're incompatible. For Burke, of course, he's a Christian. That's the fundamental thing that one has to bear in mind about him. And if you're a Christian, that means you're a natural law thinker. That's to say, you believe that the fundamental norms were, if you like, imposed upon human beings by the Creator. And Burke does believe that. The question, of course, is how one accesses those norms, how one knows them. He's not a medieval theological natural law thinker, as Stanley represented him as being. On the contrary, he's influenced by strands of what has been called modern natural law thinking, starting really in the sort of early 17th century. What that amounts to is saying that Burke believed in a sort of menu of fundamental but minimal rights, some of which I've enumerated in passing already. For instance, the right to conscience. You can't impose beliefs on people. You have a natural right to freely exercise your conscience. Burke defended that right throughout his career. At the same time, you have a right to property. I mean, Burke defends that very much as a natural right in kind of neo-Lockean terms. That's to say, naturally we will mix our labour with objects, and naturally we will acquire attachments to those things, and naturally we will generate a right of property out of them. By extension, of course, we have a right to property in ourselves. So personal security, property, and conscientious belief. These are all natural rights for Burke, but you will notice they're pretty minimal. That's to say, you don't have a right to a particular form of government. So, for instance, in France in 1789, the argument, as Burke saw it, was a group of revolutionaries came along and said there's a right to a particular type of government which ought to be applicable universally under all conditions. This he opposed, and in that context he opposes a certain language of natural right. He also opposes a language of natural right where it's interpreted as meaning the rights that we had in nature to an equal distribution of goods. As far as Burke is concerned, history has intervened since then, and we have an unequal distribution of goods de facto, and to impose natural equality in the face of that would be an act of, if you like, permanent revolution, and that is his criticism of the French Revolution. So he defends one version of natural rights, criticizes another emergent doctrine of natural rights, and believes that you can prudentially reconcile fundamental rights with practical political circumstances. So there we have natural right, utilitarian concerns, and prudence existing for Burke in an equilibrated harmony. They're not in conflict with one another.
In this score as well, you have a discussion in the book trying to situate Burke within his intellectual milieu, and you note, I think, that he is between, and maybe this is the universality of the modern mind, the need for an all-encompassing system of thought. So he's opposed to, on one hand, the enthusiasm of say, Reformed Protestant thought, or certain, I think of Calvinist thought, the theological voluntarism that it presupposes or that it works out. And then on the other hand, the pure reason of the Continental Enlightenment, of the French philosophes, and that also I think gets into the French Revolution discussion you were just having there. So he sees himself somewhere in the middle between there, not in the middle in the sense that he's pulling from them, but trying to understand how one could participate perhaps, or find a way to reconcile practical action and the artificial reason, as he says, working itself out or reconciling itself with a natural ground of justice and right.
Yes, okay, thanks very much. All very sort of complex material there. I'll just say a little bit about each.
Yeah.
First of all, enthusiasm. Now, enthusiasm was a term used in the 17th century, but also subsequently, for sectaries, religious sectaries, Protestant sectaries really, for instance in America, but also in Britain, who believed they were directly inspired by God. And Burke associated these with insurrectionaries in England in the 1640s. They believed that they knew moral truth because they had imbibed it directly from the deity. He had inspired them. Enthusiasm comes from the Greek word enthusiasmos, the putting of God into you. So they believed that the Spirit had come alive in them. And Burke, like many other Enlightenment figures, was a critic of this subordination of, if you like, stable sensibility to inspired truths. So he's a critic of that. He saw a certain similarity between that inspirational theory of moral right and the way in which French revolutionaries proceeded with their arguments from reason. For Burke, he believed that they're espousing a doctrine of pure reason, that you could reconstruct politics in accordance with pure reason, was really a sort of reworking of this inspirationist view of developing political and moral truths, and he was opposed to them. Overall, Burke believed, like many other moral thinkers in the 18th century, that our passions were there as an aid to developing correct moral attitudes. They weren't simply something that one had to repress, but rather one ought to act upon them. So, for instance, naturally we have a passion for loving our children, or naturally we have a passion for seeking the esteem of others, or naturally we have a passion for forming friendships. These are all good things, and we should act upon those passions, although fundamentally and ultimately it's also the case that we have to be able to criticize our passions from the position of reason. So he's not opposed to reason, but he thinks reason is a necessary supplement to passion, but it must not extinguish passion. We ought not to become, as it were, pure reasoners. And other contemporaries of his believe that, reason was at war with passion, and there were really some sort of neo-Stoical thinkers, essentially, that morality was about controlling passion altogether. For Burke, actually, in line with his Christian views, the deity had created us as passionate creatures to enable us the more readily to adopt a moral course of action. So, opposed to enthusiasm, opposed to pure reason, committed to passion, but so long as it's amenable to rational criticism itself.
Now, would you say he takes, is he more in the school of Hume regard passion versus reason, or reason being subservient to the passions, or does he see them not co-determining, but sort of what I think you were suggesting, that the passions help us do our duty, or they help us perform it and receive a reward for it?
Yes. Well, if one want to sort of carve up the 18th century into two enormous moral doctrines, say Hume on the one side and Kant on the other, then Burke is closer to Hume. In Burke's youth, Hume is a sort of major figure, really. He started writing political essays in the 1640s and in the early 1650s, and Burke himself would have read all of this work when he was a law student at the Middle Temple in London in the 1750s. So he was very interested in Hume, and there were others, as it were, pre-Kantian rationalists, if you like. For instance, Richard Price, whom he opposed in the French Revolution, would be an example of such a school of thought, if one is to schematize and simplify. And Burke was opposed to arguments such as Price's, which that we only have to consult our reason. So to that extent, he is closer to Hume. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, and therefore the foundation of morals is moral sentiment. However, Hume, of course, was a religious skeptic, and although Burke was in general terms some kind of skeptic, he was certainly not a radical religious skeptic. That's to say, he was committed to religious truths and was aware of Hume's religious skepticism and was deeply critical of it. So in many ways he's attracted to many aspects of Humean thought, but he also has issues with it, especially when it comes to really the sort of tone of mockery which Hume adopted against various branches of Christianity, Anglicanism in particular. So it's a sort of complicated story again, but suffice to say, Burke is committed to the idea that we are not at war with our passions, as Stoics tend to argue. On the contrary, they are there as aids to the moral vocation. But nonetheless, we must orientate that passionate moral vocation via a rational life.
These thinking about artificial reason, which we've touched upon briefly. Certain passages critics of Burke will point to try and indict him, or just these sorts of flowery passages, I guess, to our minds, to our eyes when we read them, and we think, gosh, I mean, this guy was really in love with hierarchy, or and he was to a certain extent. He was really in love with just rank and privilege, but yet I think the artificial reason discussion in your book really helps us understand why he valued those things and how they humanized us or deepened our humanity, precisely because pure reason wasn't enough in Burke's eyes, and these sort of these ranks, these hierarchies, these privileges were ways in which we could relate to one another. I'll say with love or with care and a certain type of obedience.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There's two things there. On the one hand, the question of artificial reason, and on the other hand, the question of his attitude to social order, really, in the 18th century, or the system of ranks, as it would have been called then. In regard to artificial reason, really, in that context, Burke very much means the practical reasoning that we employ and adopt in professional contexts. And the professional context in particular he had in mind was common law. So indeed, when one adopts, it's not natural reason, it's the artificial, that's to say, practical, developing over time, rational aptitude of human beings developing their faculty habits in the context of a body of knowledge. And that's a sort of controlled use of our mental faculties, and he's all in favour of that. Because it becomes schooled over time, and the artifice of the artificial means socially developing over time. It's not natural. It's not a product of the state of nature. It's something we develop as social creatures.
You would begin from your social order.
Yes.
I mean, I guess that's kind of what I was thinking. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So in relation to social order itself, we get into very tricky territory as soon as you mention the word hierarchy, because one person's hierarchy is another person's equality. So it's a sort of tricky territory. I mean, broadly speaking, Burke was a critic of, for instance, the French aristocracy. He's a strong critic of the German aristocracy. He was a sort of, outspoken critic of the sort of pre-existing feudal order of Europe, which he thinks modern commerce had reduced and civilized. But the difference between opposing those extreme hierarchies, which he did oppose, and opposing hierarchy altogether, which he thought was non-sustainable. That's to say, human beings have different aptitudes. As a result of their different aptitudes operating across time and society, they will establish differences. The art of social cohesion and politics is enabling these different aptitudes to coexist harmoniously. And broadly speaking, Burke saw modern European history as having progressively developed increasingly agreeable methods for establishing cohesion amidst, as it were, soft nuances of hierarchy rather than harsh, intensely structured hierarchical ranks, if you see what I mean. So he certainly believes that there are ranks there. They have to be defended because, of course, the alternative is permanent revolution. But that's not to say that there is no principle of equality operating in the midst of those social differences. But I should say, many 18th century thinkers who we think of as being on the sort of egalitarian end of the spectrum themselves also defended aristocracy. Rousseau is a very good example of this. So I don't think Burke defending some kind of natural aristocracy was odd. After all, in the end, so did many French revolutionaries without knowing it. I mean, as Burke pointed out, they've abolished a system of privilege and they're introducing a system of privilege more to their liking. There is no escaping privilege.
Yes. Now, the question on artificial reason and social order. So is that, I mean, in thinking about Burke, how does he know, or does he give us principles, or would he say that's not even the point? How does he know a good order, one that's worthy of defending, worthy of receiving refinement over time? Is it because it just exists, and because it exists over time, we have to regard there's some goodness in it? There's obviously a lot of something valuable there, or does he give us any sort of transcendent or timeless principles to think about?
Yes, what he does, this is complicated territory, again, because it comes really down to the doctrine of prescription. Yeah. And the doctrine of prescription in the 18th century was the idea that over time you acquire a right to things. So the extension of that in political reasoning is that over time things become legitimate by virtue of the fact that they've existed over time. Now, this was a doctrine espoused by David Hume, since we've mentioned him, but also strongly by Burke, that the very existence of something functioning over a tract of time is a form of legitimation in and of itself. And so the right to property was partly prescriptive. It's my house. I've been here for a long time. Surely I have a right to it, partly on that basis, though there are other reasons legitimating property as well. So I would say, however, that although Burke is a strong defender of prescriptive right does not trump natural right. That's to say, a custom over time which is oppressive is wrong, irrespective of the prescriptive title. So a form of social organization which is incompatible with harmony and prosperity would simply be wrong, irrespective of the amount of time over which it had endured. This becomes very clear in Burke's writings in the mid-1790s when he's writing, for instance, speaking really in the trial against Warren Hastings, the Governor General of the East India Company, who he prosecuted. He's subject to sort of public political prosecution. And in the course of launching his prosecution, Burke argued very strongly that no prescriptive title in law was capable of overturning more fundamental principles of justice. So it is important to bear in mind that Burke believes in fundamental principles of justice pre-existing history. Therefore, Leo Strauss is, as a matter of empirical fact, wrong that Burke was fundamentally an historicist. He just thought there were natural rights, but then we had to see how they developed over history. History did confer a legitimacy of its own in a way, but it didn't trump all other claims to legitimacy. So to answer your question, really, what forms of social order can be justified generally, or on what basis would one criticize an established social order? Well, really, if a society is advancing in terms of prosperity, social harmony, and in an absence of conspicuous oppression, then it's legitimate for Burke. So they're roughly speaking the criteria. That people enjoy their rights, people can acquire and better themselves in terms of goods and possessions. These are flourishing societies, and legitimate on that basis. So they're prescriptively justified, but they're also justified in terms of fundamental principles.
Yeah, interesting here. Also, you mentioned the trial of Hastings. You sort of anticipated my next line of inquiry. Also, too, interesting about the India episode with regard to prescription and social order is one of his indictments, if I recall correctly from reading your book, the East India Company had participated with certain Islamic leaders to overthrow existing political orders on the continent of India, and had helped sort of inaugurate or further the spirit of conquest in Burke's mind. And this was one of his indictments, I take it, against British policy in India, that in effect Britain had licensed its power, its authority, its monopoly of power to the East India Company, which had then even further unloosened or unleashed terror in certain parts of India that it was in control of. So we have really, there's some, it's like in America, the constant discussion right now of crony capitalism. This is something much worse than that he's pointing to. So I guess in a way we're really getting at what's ultimately at stake for Burke in India policy and why he does throw himself at the misconduct, even though, as I take it from your book, public opinion wasn't necessarily with him.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for part of the 19th century, Burke was often described as a sort of party hack who, in a sort of party spirit, pursued his own interest in many areas. The truth of the matter is, I think all modern scholars would agree, really, that Burke sacrificed a lot for the causes that he defended, and India is the shining example of this. I mean, it cost him an enormous amount in terms of labour and time, and also set him at odds with his party and also with the British public. So it's something he felt very, very strongly about. And his view was as follows, that the East India Company had acquired a trading monopoly in South Asia, however, in addition, beginning in 1757, it started to acquire a military stronghold in the north of India, and over time, by 1765, it had become itself a territorial power. And from that point on, it was afflicted by a sort of fundamental and curious conflict of interests. On the one hand, it was a trading company. On the other hand, it was a territorial power. And Burke believed that the way in which it combined these two principles of trade and political power ought to be ordinarily kept separate, but it combined them, the East India Company combined them into a sort of perverse mixture whereby, on the one hand, it was pursuing trade, but not in the spirit of free trade, but rather as a monopoly enterprise, actually pursuing political perquisites in South Asia. Because, the owners of stock, their great hope was not simply that they would get a return on their stock, but, for instance, that relations of theirs might get positions in the East India Company and therefore become administrators on the ground. So the commercial enterprise was not commercially motivated. So as a trading company, it wasn't really a trading company. That's on the one hand. As a territorial power, on the other hand, it wasn't a proper territorial power either, in the sense that government has a duty to regard the welfare of its subjects. One might call that, roughly speaking, a universal law. That's its obligation. The government is a trust imposed on human beings which they exercise over others, therefore they're obligated to them. For Burke, however, of course, if you're pursuing trade, you've no notion of being obligated to the population over whom you're exercising authority. So as a political power, the East India Company was fundamentally corrupt because it regarded its own commercial interest rather than that of the millions of Indians who fell under its suzerainty. So that was Burke's fundamental critique, that it was neither a trading enterprise nor a political enterprise, but a corrupt combination of both principles, giving rise to, and in this he agreed absolutely and fundamentally with Adam Smith. In fact, the Smithian principles in relation to the East India Company, which takes up a considerable portion of the wealth of nations, some of them are derived from Burke, with whom he would discuss the East India Company in the 1760s and 1770s. Smith also agreed that irrespective of the quality of the administrators and traders themselves, the system of government was such, this perverse combination of trade and power was such that it had given rise to the worst system of government that had hitherto emerged in modern European history.
That's incredible. On this question of Burke's pursuit of the impeachment of Warren Hastings, talk about the way. I mean, maybe this would be a good way to end the interview. And you say this cost him so much. So is this the point where we see sort of the summation of his constitutional thinking and what holds together the balance of the spirit of liberty pouring out against this misconduct?
Yes. Burke pursued criticism of the company in various ways in the late 1770s and 1780s. And that early parliamentary campaigning phase, if you like, came to a head in 1783 with Fox's India Bills. They were actually drafted by Burke, but they were an attempt to bring the East India Company under proper parliamentary control. Anyway, the point is they failed. And as a result of that, Burke was then, in a disconsolate state, thinking there was no hope for subjecting the East India Company to proper political control. However, he then latched onto the idea of course, impeachment, the tool of impeachment, could be used against the Governor-General of the East India Company, who was Hastings. And when Warren Hastings returned to England, Burke started launching impeachment proceedings. So he gave notice in 1785 that that's what he was going to do, and he started, setting out the principles on which he was going to impeach in 1786, and the impeachment itself was launched 2 years later, and then dragged on for a further 6 years, ending ultimately in failure in 1794 with, great crushing disappointment for Burke. But throughout that period, Burke wanted to attack one fundamental principle that Hastings was attached to, and that was the idea, as far as Burke was concerned, the false idea that India was historically accustomed to a form of government that was called Oriental despotism, that they were acclimatized, if you like, to despotism, and therefore Hastings claimed that he had the right to administer them on that basis. Burke responded saying, and this is an example of his attack on prescription, if you like, no set of customs can override fundamental rights. In practice, that meant that no one has a right, whatever the historically inherited situation, no one has a right to impose a system of despotism upon another people. So that sort of drove Burke as a core principle through the impeachment proceedings, which, as I said, ended unhappily for him, not only with Hastings himself being found innocent by a jury of peers in the House of Lords, but also by him actually being rewarded politically the next year. So Burke ended his political career in a way in despair. So like many political careers, it ends in failure.
It ends in failure, but the principles endure. I think.
Well, yes, I would. That would be the final point I would make. I mean, yes, political failure and world historical intellectual success. We don't read Warren Hastings; we read Edmund Burke, and Burkean principles have become vitally important foundations for political thinking since. I mean, the extent of his influence on Tocqueville and many other 19th century and 20th century figures is, if anything, underacknowledged.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's almost as if, in just thinking about this entire interview and reading your book, it's almost as if Burke is this figure within British political history where some sort of, something is happening within British government, to my mind, that is capable of really squelching a system of liberty or a constitutional spirit of liberty. And he is trying to find the principles in his political career to push against that. Successfully and unsuccessfully at times. I mean, it's actually a beautiful story. As I read your book and think along those lines about him, Richard Burke, thank you so much for discussing your book Empire and Revolution: The Political Life of Edmund Burke with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
This is your host Richard Grinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.